I came on board about 4, I think, months ago to begin the process of bringing the school towards a more classical curriculum. And Mrs. Kuhn and others said to me that perhaps it would be necessary to speak about what that means, what the classical curriculum actually entails. So I thought, well, tonight's a good night to do it. So I've drawn up a few words to say about the classical curriculum, just to present to you where the school is headed. First off, just to find out, how many of you have, a really good familiarity with the classical curriculum, that you really intimate awareness? Okay, good. How many have a partial awareness of a classical curriculum, what it's about? Okay, good. How many people have just had a whiff of it and outside the school maybe have had a hint here or there? Okay, good. Gives me a good idea. Well, what I'd like to begin with then for you is I'd like to begin giving you a bit of information about the classical curriculum. And you don't have to take notes or anything, but you may if you wish. I say to my students, you have to take notes, but you don't have to. And after I do this, I'm going to try as best I can to keep myself succinct, which is a big deal for me. I have a lot of words, and I'll try to keep myself to a half hour, and then after that I'll do a question and answer. So if you have questions from what I'm saying, I can spend a half hour answering questions. You can go to the PTO meeting after this, I think it's at 7, or what have you. And I'm also willing to linger a bit for those who want to linger a bit and ask further questions. Sound like a plan? Excellent, good. Well, let me begin with a quotation, if you will, from Dorothy Sayers. Dorothy Sayers is an author who wrote a number of different novels, mystery novels, the Lord Peter Wimsey series. She also wrote essays about academics and about education. She was herself a dom at an English school, I forget which one, college there in England back in the 1940s. But she wrote a pivotal work called The Lost Tools of Learning, which is about an 8-page essay, very well worth reading, which kind of framed the nature of the discussion, both in England and then in America. And there have been a number of schools in America that have taken her ideas and actually founded their entire school on what she's proposed. And in a nutshell, what she's proposing is that the modernization of school and the movement of schooling towards practicality has undermined the school system in general. And she, back in the 40s, was already saying that what we're going to see is we're going to see a falling apart of the schools, we're going to see chaos in the schools, lack of discipline, all sorts of isms are going to come in, and said this is because they have lost their focus. So her document was intended to refocus schools. And I'm just going to read a brief clip from her here. Is not the great defect of our education today a defect traceable through all the disquieting symptoms of trouble that I have mentioned, that although we often succeed in teaching our pupils subjects, we fail lamentably on the whole in teaching them how to think. They learn everything except the art of learning. We let our young men and women go out unarmed, in a day when armor was never so necessary. By teaching them all to read, we have left them at the mercy of the printed word. By the invention of the film and the radio, and she might have said the internet and the iPad and cell phone, we have made certain that no aversion to reading shall secure them from the incessant battery of words. They do not know what the words mean. They do not know how to ward them off or blunt their edge or fling them back. They are a prey to words and their emotions instead of being the masters of them in their intellects. It's a wonderful quotation, I think, because she's very much a prophet in this, in that she's saying that young people are going to become entranced by everything that they read, everything that they see, so that they stop understanding what's reality and what isn't. She says that young people are going in the future, that they're going to suffer the problem of being led around by media. She says that young people in the future are not going to be able to hold conversations, that they won't look you in the eye anymore, that they aren't going to be able to actually think their way through a problem. And this is this is dangerous, she says, because society rests upon that. And I'm going to add to her idea here another quotation sent your way. This is from a fellow that I like to quote, Colonel Terrence O'More, U.S. Marine Corps, and he went on to be a headmaster for many years, and he wrote this great article at the Claremont Review, which is called Wimps and Barbarians. And every year, when I taught Plato to students, I would send this article to the students to go through it. And his idea is that in the modern era, he's addressing young men especially, he says that in the modern era, education and culture in general has made it so that young men are either barbaric or wimpy. They don't have the strength to stand up for the proximate goods they need to. Their families, their ideals, their treasures, or they're barbaric, they're uncontrolled, they're dangerous, they're terrifying. And he says that this is what's called a lack of thumos, which is the Greek word for the ability to protect proximate goods. And he says this, and this will be the last quotation I share. Throughout history, men have come of age by preparing for war, going to sea, felling forests, or even mastering Latin and Greek. A close look at the culture in which boys are raised reveals not only that they are no longer encouraged to become vigorous and responsible men, but also that practically every factor affecting their development is profoundly hostile to the ideals and practices of traditional manhood and the painstaking steps necessary to attain it. The demanding regime of physical and moral instruction that used to turn boys into men, and the larger cultural forces that supported that instruction, have been systematically dismantled by a culture that ostensibly enables all individuals, but in reality disables men. That dehumanizing tyranny of pleasure, described by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, resembles the world of easy effort and easy virtue that entices adolescent males today to indulge in their appetites at the expense of their nobler longings and passions. And every year that I read this to my students, all the girls start nodding, and they're like, yeah. The guys eventually are shamed into agreeing that the author has something of a point. Well, why do I share these two things? I think that Dorothy Sayers and Terrence Moore are both onto something. That unless we re-examine our education system, we are in danger of raising a generation or two of wimps and or of barbarians. And that's why Dorothy Sayers encourages schools to go back to teach students how to learn, not just to learn subjects, but how to learn. And that's why Terrence Moore encourages young men especially, but young women as well, to start looking at education as a means to become a better human. And that's where I wanted to share with you my ideas. First, on a technical level, the classical curriculum, what is it? Well, traditionally, the classical curriculum is based on a two-part system called the liberal arts. The liberal arts are called that because, on the one hand, they're the arts of free men and women. Liberal, in the best sense of the word. Second, because this system liberates people to be able to think. So they not only are the arts that free people study, they are the arts that make people free. The one section of the liberal arts is called the trivium, and it consists of three sections: logic, grammar, and rhetoric. The other section is the quadrivium, and it consists of some stuff that I don't need to bore you with, but mostly mathematics. When we talk about the classical curriculum, we're talking about this is the basis of a classical curriculum. The trivium is how to think. The quadrivium is what to think about. Now we add to this the humanities of the Renaissance. Because in brief, historically, the Renaissance said, well, all that stuff is not worth studying anymore. We're going to study human stuff, poetry and history and literature and music and all this. And so the Renaissance, we also study that when we're talking about classical curriculum. We also look at what the Enlightenment did with its critical thought and its direct analysis. So all three of these, the medieval, quadrivium, and trivium, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment are part and parcel of what we're talking about when we're talking about the classical curriculum. But really what it boils down to is the classical curriculum is designed in order to try and encourage people to learn modes of thinking, not just subject matter, but modes of thinking. And that is based on something called the dialectic. The dialectic is essentially asking questions. Now, Aristotle, who was one of these great Greek thinkers, said that all men seek happiness, and that the best happiness is acquired by inquiry, thought, dealing with subject matter. He said that wonder is the basis of all philosophy. So if you're going to be pursuing the best happiness, the greatest happiness, you're going to be pursuing something which is about wonder and inquiry and thought. So a classical curriculum really encourages people into what's called a dialectic, to ask questions, to begin thinking about their situation. Not just to be automatons who spout everything back, but to begin asking things. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Why does a butterfly have two wings? Why does a pine cone start green and then open up slowly? Why does the sun rise in the east? Why, for instance, is a quadratic formula true? Why did the events in 1066 lead to the change in the English language? Why, for instance, does Red Riding Hood actually go into that forest and talk to that wolf? That's inquiry, it's inquisitiveness, not just spouting back things, but to begin thinking about why. Now you might hear why a great deal from your own kids, and it might get really annoying, it's true. But if they're studying a classical curriculum, it's kind of a rejoiceful thing to say, hey, you're asking why a lot. Good job, kid. Now go to your room. The why, at young age, is they're all full of zeal and exuberance. And that's what's known originally as the grammar stage. Because they love to ask why, but they also love to spout things back, to recite things, to sing songs. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, blah, 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 which we all remember, and you're all singing in your head right now, I know. When you're at that stage, between roughly kindergarten and 4th grade, you'll love recitations, you'll love songs, you'll love drills, and you're beginning to ask questions, but you're also beginning to get the fodder that you can then ask about. I mean, you can't inquire about the nature and purpose of Mother Goose if you haven't studied Mother Goose. And so as a kid, you're reading Mother Goose. Wow, that's a great story. Or poem, or whatever it is. Then you get to that recalcitrant stage, where my young son is just emerging right now. That recalcitrant stage where it's just like an uphill battle, roughly between the age of, 12 to 18 or so, where it's hard to get them out of bed and hard to get them to do anything and pick up their socks and why don't you do dishes? But they're also at a stage at that point where they're beginning to ask the questions. That there is the logic stage. They want to know why the thing is the way it is. And that's why they're beginning to challenge you and I. Because they're beginning to look and see, maybe this world is this way, and maybe it's that way. And at that logic stage, they begin asking questions about deeper and deeper material. So you can begin to get them at a level where they're actually thinking about some pretty complex things. And there are moments, I'm sure you would agree, I know I've had it with my own kids. I have 5 kids all total. One young nipper is now off at college, and I have 2 teenagers that are just emerging from their little chrysalis to become young men. And then I got 2 little sprites who are in grammar school. So I'm sure you'd agree with me that there are moments where you're so frustrated with that logic stage kid that you're pulling your hair out. What is wrong with you, kid? And then all of a sudden, like a day later or even an hour later, they come up with something that, that's impressive. That's amazing. Where'd you come up with that? And that's part and parcel of that stage, because they oscillate between being recalcitrant as anything to being just the most amazing philosophy you've ever heard. The third stage then, which is roughly 9th grade to 12th grade, but it continues after that, is the rhetoric stage. And that's where they're learning the structures of things and how things fit together and how to talk about something well. They're learning how to stand in front of a crowd and give a lecture, right? Even though they've never met anybody before in that room. They're learning how to be able to defend their position on something, or how to argue about politics, and really argue. I mean, not just spout back what they've heard before. That rhetoric stage is where they start reading some serious and powerful documents. The Constitution of the United States, the Federalist Papers, Plato, Aristotle, Iliad, the Odyssey, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Shakespeare. They're reading stuff which is really profound and deep and challenging. So you've got your three stages. You've got your grammar, your logic, and your rhetoric. And roughly, kids are going to fall into those three stages, and what we use, we gear towards that age group. But everything that we use is used to get them to ask questions. Along those lines, it's important in a classical curriculum, as it is in any curriculum, to give them the best stuff possible. And this is sort of the second part of what a classical curriculum really consists of. On the one hand, it's the dialectic, the asking questions. On the other hand, it's reading, studying, looking at the very best things possible. If you're trying to work yourself up in a sporting manner, you try to do the best exercises possible. You try to eat the best foods possible. You look at the people that know the sport. You're not going to study some scrub soccer player in order to learn soccer. You look at Pele. Well, that's my generation. You look at Pele, or you look at somebody who's really fantastic at the sport, and you imitate them. Then the same is true with education. Right? When you're trying to craft young souls, young minds, you don't want to feed them with things that are trivial or trite or ephemeral that will disappear in a minute. You want to take what's best, time-honored, those things that people have thought about for years and years and years. And that's what you give them. Now, could that be modern material? To some degree, yes. But the problem with modern material is it's modern material. Literally, it's been written in the last 50 years or so we don't know whether it's going to be time-honored. So we try to look at things, not necessarily Roman Greek, but things that have been around for a while. So to the end of the dialectic, anything that can cause inquiry in the child, anything that prompts them to begin thinking about their situation, that's what we use. Second, though, is that we try to use what's best to give to the student. The best programs we can find, the best literature, the best math methodology, the best historical sources. And by doing so, by this sort of two-pronged program, we prompt young people to learn their inheritance, what their fathers and their grandfathers studied, but also we prompt them to begin asking questions about their situation. Well, that may lead us to think, well, what does a classical curriculum offer then? What is the end goal? Well, in basic outline, I've been teaching the classical curriculum in one form or another for 22 years. 22 years. What I have seen, and I say this as sort of testify, I'm testifying. What I have seen is that the classical curriculum produces 5 major things, which are amazing to see. Because you see, I was telling students the other day, I knew this kid when he was in 7th grade, and he was just the most annoying sort of, you wanted to boot the kid down the stairs. He was always asking questions, getting in your face, being annoying. What did he do to this program? And I taught him for 6 years. He graduated from my tutelage, and he went on to be a tank commander in Afghanistan. He's now in his early 30s. And he was writing me a couple years ago saying to this class, first of all, thanks, and I apologize. And then he said, I need your help, because now I'm dealing with snot-nosed kids. I have to train these guys. How do I do it? So it's amazing to see a young person who you never think is really going to match up to what you want, transforming through this program and becoming somebody who can be as powerful as a tank commander, or a business leader, or a coach on a soccer team or a football team, or what have you. So the 5 things that I've seen the classical curriculum offer. Students learn the basics, first off. They learn writing, reading, mathematics, so that they can function in the world. They also learn history, not social studies. They learn history. They learn theology, not just religion, but theology. They learn music, composition of both essays and music. They learn self-expression and public speaking. These are the things that were always emphasized. When you see this in a student who can stand up and publicly speak, self-express, knows music, knows history, that's an impressive thing. It's a bulk of information they carry around that they will have for the rest of their life. Now, the second thing that we see is that students become versed in the greatest works of human culture. When all you know is pop culture, it's like you skip over life like a stone over clear water. When you know the greatest things of human culture, that's deep. That's deep stuff. And then you can know pop culture very, very well. You can recognize in pop culture the repetition of these great, profound things. But students become versed in the greatest works of human culture, and then they're even more fun to talk to about pop culture. Their opinions actually matter about that sort of thing because they know this compared to that. The third thing I've noticed is that students change in their behavior. They learn to observe, to question, to discuss, to research, and more deeply understand the ideas that have occupied great minds for generations, and they don't take those things for granted. And that, to me, is amazing. This is probably, for me, the highlight of the program. They don't take those things for granted. How often have we said to our sons or our daughters, I suffered for this, your dad or my father suffered for this, why don't you take this seriously? What we find in the classical program is that they do start taking it serious. They do start realizing how much blood has been shed so that they can be free. And that's a powerful thing. The fourth thing is more practical, really. They actually become more employable, which is interesting to me. I was reading the other day, I think it was in Forbes magazine or someplace like that, where they said, look, what we're looking for people that are liberally educated. Because they're the people that ask questions. They're the people that improve the product. They're the people that look at demographics and don't just say, oh, well. They look at demographics and say, we can fix that, this, and that, and this. This reminds me of Parmenides, and maybe we should change that the way that Aristotle suggested. And it's amazing to see that. They become far more employable, which is nice, because then they can, pay the rent and things like that. They also become more innovative, more self-controlled. That's always nice. More trustworthy, more well-spoken. As a throwback to my friend Terrence Moore, USMC, more thumatic. Great word, thumatic. Through this program, young men and young women both learn what's really important, and they will defend it tooth and claw. Either through argument or sometimes through actions. And last, as Christians, as Catholics, we take faith very seriously too. And well, we should in our modern world. I was thinking the other day, September 11th, reflecting back 16 years and where I was, how powerful, how moving it was. Because it was a contest of faiths, right? It was. How do we see the world? Do we see it as destructive and pointless, or do we see it as having a purpose? As Christians, as Catholics, we see the world as having a purpose. How can we not? The fifth thing is that they begin to take their faith more seriously because they see what has been sacrificed for them to have that faith. And so they grow in their spiritual life and they become better people. Now I'm going to end with this little bit, because I always like to end with Dante. Dante's awesome. So, through the classical liberal arts, we're attempting to train young people to be self-aware, self-critical, self-disciplined. Attempting to reveal to them the wealth of treasure, both intellectual and artistic, which is their inheritance. We're attempting to show to them the beauty in the created world that leads them to see the good, the true, and the beautiful of God's order in the Logos. A classical liberal arts education primarily seeks to instill in students a sense of wonder at their world, to grow in them the skill of seeing multiple sides to an issue, to ground them in the desire for truth, and to initiate them into a lifelong love of learning. Ultimately, a classical liberal arts education seeks to make free men and women who are arbiters of their own happiness under God. It seeks to strengthen young people to be, as Dante Alighieri tells us, as new trees are, renewed when they bring forth new boughs, pure and prepared to climb under the stars. I like that as an ending point. It's Dante's. And I love that. Half hour. Pretty good. It's a half hour for question and answer. So here I am. Here I stand. I shall not recant. Yes, Mark.
So what does that mean in terms of specific changes in terms of course offerings that are going to be made?
Excellent question. Thank you. We've already made two changes you might have noticed in the grammar school. One is that we are instituting in the English program the junior grade books. Junior grade books has a program that encourages in students inquiry into text. It also shows them how to analyze, cut apart a text, so that as they progress as young people, they're learning not just grammar and spelling, which is important, but they're also learning how to analyze a text. It carries over into the middle and then into the upper. We've also instituted in the theology program a program by Ignatius Press, which is the Faith and Life series. Faith and Life also encourages the teacher to bring in all sorts of supplements, but also encourages students to ask questions about their faith, to learn the basics, but to ask questions about their faith. Now, what does that mean in terms of other very important subjects like mathematics? That's still up for debate. We have tossed about what we want to use for a program for mathematics. It has been suggested that the Singapore math might be something very attractive. We haven't moved yet on that. Historically, we have moved last year, I believe, to the Core Knowledge Curriculum program, which I find is an excellent program for giving the students history rather than social studies. And history that repeats every 4 years, so that they're learning more about the same subject every 4 years, but also sticks to the history, the basics of history, Western history, rather than spiraling to other subjects that maybe are not as important. What does it mean in other programs? Right now, every teacher here is in a discussion, an ongoing discussion, about how they can bring this inquiry, this dialectic, into their programs. So I've been in discussion with music and PE. She's really given a lot of thought to this. It's quite mens sana in corpore sano, the Latins used to say. And she really took that to heart. A sound mind and a sound body. So she's thinking, how can she put this into her program? You know, we're looking at what to do with language, too. Spanish is a great language, and it's a great vehicle for teaching the classical program. We don't know whether that's what we're going to go with or whether down the road we want to move to a Latin. So that's up in the air right now. We're sticking with Spanish for now. And then I suppose that's pretty much the gamut. If there's another specific program, I do know that this does mean that we're changing as much as we can, even the atmosphere itself of the school. That we're putting up more classical artwork. We are making the school, the colors in here, for instance, have changed. And we're thinking about that as well as an aesthetic way of producing classical thought in students. I think that about covers it. Did I miss anything on that one? Does that help? Okay.
How quickly will all of this happen?
Oh, I'm very slow. How quickly? I would like to give the best possible things to students as soon as I can. That's my desire. But I also understand that change sometimes does take a while. So, do I have a 5-year plan? I don't know if I have a 5-year plan. What I have is a plan to revisit what we have, to see what works, to move forward here or move forward there. to do it all at once would, I think, be somewhat chaotic, more chaotic than we want at this point. So it will be incremental, this program, that program. If by the way, you were looking to have a really sudden change, I'd love to hear from you. I really would, because I'd like to find out how to do that. I don't think it's right now something that is desirable, because that suddenness of change. Teachers are teachers. We have our own lives that we have to live as well. Learning a whole new subject or learning a whole new methodology takes some time. So for us, having to learn the junior grade books this year was quite sufficient. Having to learn the Ignatius was quite sufficient. Learning the CKC last year is still quite sufficient. To move to new programs in other areas would take some time. Yes?
How do you perceive incorporation of classical curriculum and modern sciences?
Great question. Very good question.
Can you repeat the question?
How do you see an incorporation of the classical curriculum with modern sciences? Great question. First off, Mrs. Riefmeyer, Becky Riefmeyer in the middle school, and I have been in contact about this very subject. One of the things we'd really like to see is we would like to see a science program that encourages students, first of all, to have a hands-on experience with the world. So that their science is not simply looking at a book, but actually fiddling with sand, to find out about slump and flow. Looking at insects to find out how they're designed. Working in chemistry if possible. Now, is there a text that does that? I don't know yet. But when we find one, that's what we would do. What we won't do is we're not going to go back to say, wasn't to say again studying the same here twice, like Hippocrates. We're not going to go back just to study Greek medicine or Greek science, although that'll be part of our history program. We're going to try to bring students up to the latest in understanding science through hands-on experience. Does that help? Yes?
Question, technology, so that students are better suited for college, well, high school. I guess I have a two-part question. Number one, does this position us for, there's been talk about a 9 to 12 grade at some point?
Yep.
And then my second question is how are you going to tie technology into the classical curriculum learning and ensure that students are, they're prepared for high school, but then college and work life?
Right.
I mean, I can tell you right now, I'm working with some kids that are young in college, and it's just like there's no technology experience, which really surprises me.
Yeah, it surprised me too. So it's a three-part question. Okay. What sort of ideas do we have about the possibility of a 9 through 12 program? How are we going to incorporate technology into the program we are trying to design? And what are we doing to ensure that students will be ready to use technology in high school and beyond?
Yes.
In brief, I don't know immediately. But I don't mean to be facetious, because it's a very, very good question. Again, fantastic. Thanks for being here. These are great questions. To address one at a time, the 9 through 12 idea is still on the boards. Father and I and Jay have been talking about this very possibility. And Mrs. Kuhn, we've been talking about how do we move in that direction. And of course, we have things like finances and land and all that rigmarole that goes into it. But the idea is that we really do want to eventually consider moving to a 9-12 program as well. So there's that. How then are we incorporating technology into the classical program? Yeah. Cautiously, but with sufficient ability so that students will actually be able to use technology right. And that's a tricky thing, because I want to ask you how many of your children have cell phones, because I've been holding off. My daughter already has one. And she's immediate. She had it for like a couple months, and she's away, right? So how do we get students to think critically about the technology they have so they don't get sucked into all the nonsense, right? And at the same time, how do we get them to learn technology so they aren't completely Luddites when they get out in the world at large? That is a razor's edge to walk. I can guarantee you this: we are considering it very seriously. We are neither going to be a completely non-technology school where we throw all technology out, nor are we going to be a school that allows students complete face masks for a 360 total immersion. Because both those they're extremes. What students do need to learn is they need to learn how to operate in a technological world, because that's their world. I hate to admit it, it's not mine anymore. You know, I'm at an age now where I actually prefer sitting by the pool with a beer. You know, pardon me, I like beer. I don't prefer sitting in front of a screen. I really don't. I don't prefer looking at a screen. I prefer, you know, enjoying myself, going out for a bike ride. They're of an age now where they have to wrestle with the fact that they'll be on 8 to 12 hours staring at a screen sometimes if they're not careful. So how do we deal with that? That's a great question. And it leads partly to the answer to the third question: how do we ensure? Well, I'm not sure how to ensure either way necessarily, but I can say that we can prevent certain excesses, definitely. And I can say that we can put things in place so that they are exposed to how to use the technology right as best we can. I can do that. And then what they do with it is kind of what they choose. Hopefully, in learning in other subjects, history and science and literature, they will learn the discerning process so that when they have to make that decision themselves, they are armed to do so. Okay? Does that help?
Yep, it does.
Great question. This is cool.
I think some of the questions here can be summed up and answered too if we address, and Will, you'd be excellent to speak to this, how we're working on the formation of our teachers, virtuous leadership, and then some of the training that they've attended over the summer. So I'll let Will address that, but some of what we're doing is working with our teachers so that they can effectively help us informing our students.
Right. I'll just speak to that. First off, I've got to say, the folks I'm working with now are excellent people. They're fantastic people at their jobs. They really are. It's impressive just to walk into a place and see the people. They know their stuff. They know what they're doing. You know, it's quite a relief. Now, from the start, I remember this conversation, Mr. Schultz. We had this conversation. Teachers have been kind of like classical curriculum, you know, a little spooked by it, and so we came to Jesus moment, right? Where we realized that what we really needed to do was to address the classical curriculum in a way that teachers could grapple with. So I began to work with teachers to explain how best to put this into practice in your classes. And I suggested to them that classical curriculum was dialectic, asking questions. And that hit home because a lot of people were like, oh, I did that already. I said, yeah, I know. So that was in place. I've begun already to share with teachers articles and thoughts on the classical curriculum so they can have access to it. I have a nefarious plot whereby I am feeding everybody on the staff music on a regular basis, and I'm going to begin feeding them bits and pieces of Aristotle's works and of Plato's works and the like, so they see what this stuff looks like. Okay, it's coming for those teachers in the crowd. In addition to this, we've also hired a young fellow, he's my age, a young fellow to come in and give talks to the teachers in hour-long sessions. I think two more sessions to talk about the language of the classical program, to try and get teachers to understand the language of the classical program. The third thing we're doing is that I'm keeping very close ties to what teachers are doing in the classroom. I'm not a control freak, really not. I just keep ties with people so that I'm trying to help coach them through how best to implement this in their classrooms. Because on the one hand, no teacher wants to simply say, we're going to become very strict, disciplinarian, because that's what the Romans did. They used to beat their students. We're going to do that. We don't want that, okay? But what we do want is we want teachers to be able to have this internally, so that it flows out of them, so that this knowledge becomes something which is like their life. And they simply give that life to their students, which many of them are already doing in spades. My kids in class have two great people who already give their life to their students. And what I want to do is I want to be able to help them, those teachers, have more abundance in their life to be able to give to the students. And so I'm helping them to inculcate, to take in this classical program. I hope that speaks more or less to where we're headed. Okay. Other questions, Giffen?
Can you speak more about the oldest students in the school and what changes they're having? Any textbook changes, any higher expectations or grading changes?
Yes, good question. We're talking the 8th and 7th grade, roughly, yeah. For them, I can speak to the literature certainly, because I've already been doing that. There have been no massive changes in curriculum overall for 8th and 7th. There has been a change in using a text, which I think was begun last year in history. So that's not new. That's something they're already doing. They're studying history as history. In literature, they're reading texts that are challenging. Charles Dickens, for instance. They're going to be reading Stevenson, Treasure Island. They're going to be reading Robert Frost, poetry. And that's going to be challenging. But they're also being taught how do you take a work of that size and produce it. Now, my opinion on that is that they have 4 years before they hit those rocky roads of college. I won't see them for 4 years because we aren't going to have a 9 to 12 program in time. So I have 1 year to work with them, to mold them so that they have some a core for their lifting, right? It's like mental lifting, you have to develop your core first. To work with them so that they can digest material on the level of Charles Dickens or Stevenson. I'm going to be working with them also so that they learn how to write an analytical essay, which I consider to be extremely important. College does analysis, summary, and a little compare and contrast. Creative writing is not a huge thing in most colleges. You can't creative write a text when you're studying theology. There's not a lot of creative writing in history programs. And so I hate the thought of sending students out to a college where they have to do those things and they don't know what they're doing. So to try and get them for a year to start learning, to start working with an analytical essay, and start with summary, and then do compare, contrast, and then do analysis. So they get at least a rudimentary idea. In terms of grading, I can't speak to anybody else's grades because there's no uniform grade policy right now. It's changing. My grading policy to reveal, I try to give students as much benefit of doubt as possible because they are working towards a goal. So I don't normally try to work in terms of grades with a strict formula. What that means for me is that if a student goofs up in the first couple weeks of school and then really tries hard and hard, I actually find myself making their grades so that it reflects their effort, their work towards a goal. And for me, that's important because it's like forgiveness of sins in a way. If our sins were held against us, who would stand, right? If my goofing off on the first 3 quizzes were held against me, I couldn't stand. So, but I also offer students the possibility of fixing mistakes. I also offer students the possibility of having multiple ways to have their grade picked up so that their grade doesn't become the thing that gets them down. I find this happened with my daughter. Her grade got to be so poor because she was late on things. And they had a policy where it went down 10 points every day that was late. And so by the end of 4 days, who cared? 5 days, and she wouldn't bother. And it just was devastating for her. She had a year where she just didn't want to do anything anymore. It was just crushing. And I thought, well, that's not good, right? How do you do that to a student? So for my grading policy, I don't do that. And I can't speak to other teachers necessarily, but it might be something that I would like to talk with teachers and say, how do we have an equitable grading policy so that it reflects students' efforts rather than just you have to goof up on a couple here and too bad. That to be some very draconian. I'm sorry, I'm waxing eloquent. Am I answering your question? Okay. Yes.
How does the classical curriculum work with kids that have IEPs?
Oh, wow, very good question. Very good question. To answer that, I've already scheduled a couple meetings with our counselor here to try and modify the program because it is an issue. Kids that have IEPs, when they come up against something like Dickens or Stevenson, it's going to be a hard climb, definitely. So I've talked with her already about the possibility of other inroads. Yes, using texts like the Classics Illustrated, or using texts like the what was that bound version of Stevenson's, like a simplified version of, to get the story down. Or watching the movie first, for instance, or having it on audio books. There are numerous inroads into the story that can help a student that has difficulty. So if they try to go back to the actual text, they have at least an ability to encounter it. Yeah. And that's an ongoing process, I have to say. So it has been perfected. Good question. Yes?
Can you, if after 9 you want to learn a little bit more, can you recommend some places to go online or books, something that we can look at?
Very good question. Twofold answer to that. Well, threefold. Yes. Second is that online I already have a couple links at my web page from the school. And third, I have a brochure that I have back here near Mr. Schultz, which is not published by us. It's published by another publishing company that does classical literature in general. And it's a great outline of what the program looks like. Okay? Yes. Yes.
Can you talk more about other schools and institutions that have taken on classical curriculum?
The two that I know most intimately are St. Agnes and Providence Academy. Providence Academy began with the classical curriculum. That's what they designed the thing originally on. And it's going like hotcakes now. You know, I just looked at their website and they're still going very, very strong. Now, and if you've seen the school, their whole aesthetic was based around this classical curriculum. I mean, the place looks like Jefferson's mansion or something. It was crazy. We used to joke that we're working in Wayne Manor. You know, there's a big cave underneath there that we go down every day to drive up. So Providence Academy is one that's a very good one to look at to see what they're doing. The other one is St. Agnes over there across the river. And St. Agnes, if I'm not sure, I think Michael Atkins was telling me that they adopted the classical curriculum some 4, maybe 5 years ago. And before that, the school was just all over. It was really kind of chaotic. And they made the decision to adopt that program. And they thought at first this is going to not fly, but they went ahead with it anyway. And attendance was up, enrollment was up, giving was up. Everything just increased. You had teachers that were coming there that say, "I want to work at this school." And Atkins has this really invigorating story about how they turned that school around. He's my hero. So those are the two that I would most readily look at. Yeah. Is that your question?
It's one of my questions. So I know you said this, so you're still thinking about this, but for instance, if you're taking away something like Spanish and putting in Latin, most high schools around here don't have Latin as their foreign language.
Right.
So how are these students that come out of 8th grade going into a high school, where are they going to be standing? Right now, kids from Epiphany go out and go into public school and they're ahead of the game. Where are they going to be on a leveling field, playing field?
Great question.
They've got Latin and they're starting with Spanish for one.
Great question. Did everybody hear that question? Because I think it's a very fine question. Okay. The question essentially is, if we go to a Latin program,
Or any subject, whether you're taking away social studies, putting in history, which I support. But you know what I mean? How does that measure up with what they're going to get in high school?
okay,
Aside from history.
okay. If we switch out any program that we have now, how would it match up with a high school that the young man or woman decides to go to? So an example is if we switch out Spanish, for instance, for Latin, where would they stand when they go on to high school? In my experience, and that's all I can give right now. In my experience, if we switch out classes so that they're teaching kids how to learn, they would still be way ahead of their peers by leaps and bounds. Not because they know the subject matter better, but because they can acquire the subject matter better. Okay. If you have a student who has gone through 4 or 5 years, say, of social studies, and cannot figure out why the Battle of Cumae was important, or why we chose to invade Normandy Beach on D-Day, or what the impact of the decision to unify Germany was. If he can't figure those things out, he's going to have a rough time in history. But if he's been trained, or she's been trained to think about cause and effect, character, geography, then when they go to study a new subject, like say the Spanish Civil War, then they can say, well, that makes sense, that came from that. This guy's personality was such when you plugged him in, he became a tyrant. That affected this, and automatically he can acquire that material a lot better. Now, for the language program, or for programs that are sequential, mathematics, for instance, to take an example, right now we don't have immediate design to switch out the language program, so there is that. And we still have on the table the possibility of a 2-track program. There's that. And I may be speaking out of turn, Mrs. Kuhn, please throw a brick at me if I am. But we still have on the table the possibility of Latin in the grammar school that leads to a 2-track continuation of Latin or Spanish. That's a possibility. Another possibility is to have young people learning Spanish primarily with Latin supplementing, or to have English from Latin roots with Spanish as a specialist. The other possibility is that in high school they could choose to take Latin for the first time. Because I know Trinity School does Latin, I think, in 7th grade, and they go on for 3 years after that. So there are a number of different models for that program. So the time to panic about that is not necessarily it yet. But to your larger question, if we're training students as to how to think about things, how to acquire things, and if they have a bulk of really powerful material, then if they go to a school that's studying powerful material, they'll plug it right in. It'll just be like East meets West. If, on the other hand, they're meeting material that is subpar, they can compare it to this great stuff they've got before, and it'll be like a walk in the park. I know that a number of my students, like if I take the essay, for instance, a number of my students came back after the freshman year of college, like, I'm teaching people in my dorm how to write, And then there's a little bit of thanks, and we chat for a while, But it's that sort of thing where if we're switching out our programs, we aren't doing it haphazardly. I dislike isms. I really do. So if we're changing to this enthusiasm and that enthusiasm, we're just like a feather in the wind. But if, on the other hand, we're choosing consciously, after great amounts of debate, what programs will best serve this ability to think, well, then we shouldn't have too much of a problem. Okay? And if there's a big problem on the horizon, again, I'd love to hear from people. I really would. And it won't be like a mystery. It won't be like, hey, guess what? We're going to be doing German, or Greek tomorrow. It won't be like that. It would be more like, we are considering this. We'd love to hear your input. And then we would have, several months or even maybe a couple of years before we made the change. So it's not going to be a terribly sudden, gird up yourself for studying Swahili. Okay? Yes, last question, I think. Yes.
It's a quick one. Will you be teaching logic in junior high?
If I had my way.
He's nodding.
He's nodding his head. Yes, he wants to teach logic. Yes.
I like the idea of getting logic into them in junior high so that wherever they go off to in high school, they've got a good, strong foundation of how to think.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Logic is a wonderful exercise. It's just incredible. And it solidifies modes of thought so well. If we could do it, I'm all for it. Okay, so I think Mr. Schultz is too, giving this. I am willing to linger afterwards, but I do know people have to get to a PTO meeting. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me here tonight and having me here for the rest of the year as well. So thank you.